Hi all, let's look at another interesting game from the World Cup. This is in round 5, the fourth game of round 5 actually. Peter Svidler battling it out with Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, and they previously had draws, so these games are getting increasingly more critical. C4 from Peter Svidler, the English opening. C5 we have symmetrical variation, knight F3, knight F6, knight C3, now D5. That pawn is taken, knight takes. Now usually G3 is played here. This is the most common approach. For example, with bishop G2 the knight often goes back. Fairly standard position. But in this game a more adventurous variation was played here, E4. The drawback is it's weakening D3, and in fact black pounces on that with knight B4. But the nifty idea, you could argue it's a very nifty looking idea, bishop C4, just to invite knight D3 check. That's played. King E2, knight F4 check, and now the king drops back to F1. Now white is actually threatening things like D4 here, hitting that knight. The knight helps bind that D4 square. So yeah, it's interesting that the king's been misplaced, and the rook you might think is an issue, but surely that can be sorted out with the move played H4. Yes, but actually this position has been seen quite a bit before actually, and the usual thing that's played is B4, trying to break this positional bind. I'll give you an example. C takes, knight D5, or knight E2. And in both cases, white can potentially play for D4 or bishop B2. It's an interesting game anyway. So this is actually a little bit of an innovation move, H4 immediately, not B4. So we see knight D4, D3. Yeah, the problem with white's position is that, well, as well as the king being misplaced, it's a little bit passive actually with this. Without being able to play D4, it's as if black's got a grip on the centre really, which is difficult to do anything about. E6 just keeps this bishop blunt. Bishop F4. A6, as though B5 is going to be on the cards. White took now on D4 and played knight E2. You can see white's pieces are a bit on the passive side for the white pieces. Generally, knight C6, A3, bishop D6, bishop takes D6, queen takes D6, queen D2. Black doesn't seem to have too many problems here. Of the bishop D7, we see a move which doesn't look entirely solid, shall we say, but the thing is black has got a nice looking position with the potential knight E5, maybe sometimes in the future. White, perhaps, it looks like a weakening move, F4. Just intuitively, it looks like a weakening move. And black played E5, which, okay, unblondes the bishop, but it's questioning this whole thing now. It will be positionally ridiculous, surely, to take on like this. That's a very nice knight on E5. So white goes for F5, but there's a drawback. The pawn chain can be undermined, and it's immediately undermined. G6, knight G3, and it's attacked again. And now an awkward looking move just to pin the pawn to D6. Okay, that's a problem for black to solve. And also it seems queen G7 might be a problem. Black radically solves the issues here. Can you guess what can you guess what black played here? So there's a few ideas for white. Queen G7, you know, hitting F7, maybe taking on H7, that pawn's pinned. So black to play, what would you play with black? If I give you 5 seconds. Okay, black just castled queenside. Because the king's on F1, it doesn't matter so much, surely, about F7, because then something like rook F8 and the king's on F1 here. So white is in a bad state, it seems. H5, as though maybe, you know, HG, or bishop F7 then HG, and then taking the rook on H8. It's very tactical, the concept. But the big but here, black in this position basically unpins the g6 pawn. Can you see how? There's a couple of good moves in this position. I believe this is one of the strongest. Black played king c7 protecting the queen, which means now g takes f5 is threatened, hitting the queen. And now another alternative is also here, by the way, queen f6. This seems adequate as well for black. The knight can go back to kick the queen out, and this is okay for black. So yeah, but king c7 is also a very strong move. We see bishop takes f7, g takes f5, yeah, and it seems to make this a whole waste of time in a way. So hitting the queen, queen's coming off, but now that f file looks just terrible with the king there. Knight takes f5 though, first, and then actually knight e3 looks like a monster threat. Knight e4 check, king e7. Yeah, and this knight e3, it's a horrible knight on e3. Bishop c6, this just looks horrible. The knight controls that f file. Black can easily build up now. Black's got a beautiful position, really powerfully entrenched knight. White's got really no counterplay here. Rook h3, it's very, very awkward. I mean, what can we do? What can white do to protect that pawn? If rook h2, black would simply say take on e4, then knight g4 hits the rook and prepares rook f2 check, so it'll be all over. So very difficult position. So rook h3 in very difficult position. Knight takes g2, threatening knight f4 check. It's basically all over now. White desperately sacks the exchange. Rook g3, trying to get maybe a final attack. Check. But now just rook b8, ignoring the possibility of rook g7 altogether, because it doesn't seem to be mating here, unfortunately for white. In fact now, yeah, the bishop under fire, bishop f7 doesn't look the greatest place because it walks into a self pin after rook b7. But there was nothing really better here. If bishop c4, rook takes b2, threatening, well, all sorts of things. For example, knight g2 check, king moves, rook f1. So yeah, it's a lost position anyway. The self pin just seals the deal, and the game ended here. White didn't bother trying knight d6. It's not going to last too long, this support for that pin after rook d7, for example. White's losing material. For example, rook g8, we just take, then take on d6. Yeah, what can we say about this game? It was a bit of a risk, it seems, the opening, but it has been trodden territory before. But white usually doesn't play h4. White usually tries to play b4, very dynamic play, but I think it needs a lot of theoretical preparation, this line. It's interesting, very interesting game though, very interesting opening choice. So unfortunately I believe this knocks out Peter Svidler from the World Cup, who is like a people's favourite. He's a fantastic commentator as well as player, and a great personality of course on sites like Chess24 doing commentary. So yeah, he's a nice guy. Unfortunately, yeah, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, I believe, is through on this game. Okay, comments, questions, likes, shares appreciated. Thanks very much.